As you came in tonight, I had some handouts, or you can grab them on your way out if you're interested. They're just different propaganda from the center, but I'm going to be alluding to some of them to our framework as a way of thinking about ethical decision making. I'm going to be using a lot of slides and illustrations, and there's some films that go along, which we may or may not use parts of tonight. But I just want to give you a couple of pages that you can get at www.scu.edu/character. That's our character education page. And all of the slides and notes for tonight will be posted there tomorrow. So I was posting there the next day, so you can download the materials from there if you're interested. Our main web page is at scu.edu/ethics. So if you look at those two pages, those are our two ethics web pages. I mentioned the Markville Center for Applied Ethics is actually the largest ethics center in the world. And those are the two most consulted web pages. Those are the two biggest hits on the web for ethics materials. So we get about 3.5 million unique visitors a year to our web page. And the character page is specifically materials for teachers. So we keep the teacher materials on the character page, and everything else is on the ethics page, but just to make it easier to find. Or if you go to the ethics page, you can get to the character page. Then we have another program I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about, professional ethics in teaching. I'm going to talk about what happens in a digital space. I'm particularly going to talk about the idea of blended learning. And I can give you some examples of materials that we use for blended learning in some of our projects. And one of those is a daily news aggregator and lesson plan called Newsworthy. And this is its address, cbonewsworthy.org. And I'm going to take you through some processes, see some of the materials we actually use to do this. And then you have my email. So a couple things there. So the things, remember, if you just SCU, Santa Clara University.edu/character and ethics, and it's on the material that you picked up as you came in as well. So let me start kind of talking about what do we mean by professional ethics, and particularly professional ethics for anyone. You know, what kind of life do we have? What kind of obligations do we have beyond law or beyond what a contract requires, beyond our social obligations, or even beyond the particular vocational skill that our job requires? Some people, when they talk about professional ethics, say, well, truth of the matter is, without professional ethics, you could do anything as a teacher. And what they mean by that is there really would be no way of deciding what we should do or not do if we didn't come to some kind of professional ethics. But the question always begs is, are we really a profession anymore? As teachers, are we kind of merging into some kind of technical trade instead, with less and less autonomy about what we do? One of the things I'll talk about tonight. But I'd like to suggest that teachers show many of the marks that we consider when we talk about what's a profession, and some of those marks. And I just want to start by sort of dancing around the question whether teaching really still is a profession by saying it certainly requires specialized knowledge and skills. It certainly has a standard of care and work. There's certainly a standard of professional ethics that we have. We have obligations to students and society. Our motivations are all about student success, about student learning. And we're certainly collegial and foreign people in the profession. Now, these are 6 of the 7 or 8 marks that we talk about a profession having. And I'd say we have all of those, but do we? Another question I'm going to raise tonight is, so what does a teacher need to know and be able to do in a digital world today? When I started teaching, high tech was, my credential program, we took a course on how to write on the blackboard. And that was the technology course, was the blackboard and an overhead projector. And so when I think of the kinds of technology I routinely use in the classroom now versus when I started teaching, the kinds of skills you need as a teacher have changed greatly. We talk about that a lot in a model called TPAC. The idea that a teacher needs technical knowledge, pedagogy, teaching information, and content knowledge all together. And so you'll see this diagram all the time in this field that talks about, whenever we think about what it means to be a competent teacher, part of that is, what do you know about content in the world itself? What do you know about how to teach, and how do you use technology, and what's the spot that brings all that all together? Because professional ethics starts by being competent at the things that are necessary for a teacher. And to be an ethical teacher means to be a competent teacher in all of those 3 areas at the very least. But the question I wonder is, if you're a digital teacher, are we equally competent? If I look at this set of questions about our uses of technology, are we at the same ethical standard as we are, say, on teaching methods, pedagogy, or on our knowledge of content? And I'm not so sure. If you were to think yourself for a minute, if you just rate yourself for a moment on how how well would you say you do against these standards for your knowledge of the content you teach, your knowledge of how to teach it, your knowledge of how to use technology skills for teaching it? So if you just kind of think about that in your mind for a second. Maybe another way of looking at this would be, what do you think you know the most about? The content you're supposed to teach, the processes for teaching it, or the technological tools that allow you to teach it? Would you turn to the person at your elbow for the next 30 seconds? Which of those three would you say you know the most about and why? Let me just get a quick show of hands. How many of you chose C, content is the thing you know the most about? How many of you chose P, pedagogy, teaching methods is the one you know the most about? How many of you chose P, technology, the tools to do that, as the one you know the most about? So you see, and some of you didn't vote, but as you were right, very good. Don't be coerced. But I think it's really interesting when I look at that. Sometimes when I do this with large groups of people and I ask that question, one of the things I notice is the younger the group is, the more hands I get on this end. The older the group is, the more I think, and what I can see right away is generationally what generation of training people came from. It tells me a lot about what was emphasized at that point. Tonight I'm going to talk about professional ethics, and I'm going to start by looking at our take from the Markle Center. The kind of way we look at the Markle Center is that, if you think about the different stages you go through in your life, as a student, as a young teacher, as an administrator, as an older teacher, as a professional teacher, as a parent, all the roles you have in your life, one of those roles is as the professional roles you have as a teacher or whatever you may happen to do. And so one of the ways we approach is to look at the fact that I have a variety of values that inform the roles I play in my life. In each of those roles, I interact with different stakeholders, other people who have an interest in what I work on, and that results in my having various obligations, and at some point those obligations start to compete, which puts me into unavoidable dilemmas. And so a way we like to think about what professional ethics is about is understanding the reality that I play many roles in my life with many different people with different interests, and those conflicting obligations mean inevitably there's a conflict. I have dilemmas within them. What we do in professional ethics is try to find a way to work through that that's consistent with the values that are important to you. So you think about it, who are your stakeholders? Who's affected by your teaching? And what obligations do you have to others? What unavoidable dilemmas is that likely to lead to? So I'd like to actually stop for a minute and ask you to turn back to the person at your elbow. And actually, I just want you to focus on two parts of that question. Who is most affected by your teaching or future teaching if you're not yet teaching? And can you think of at least one unavoidable dilemma you might find yourself in the teaching world around technology? I'm going to talk about 20 of them a little later, but why don't we just start by seeing if there's one that just pops to your mind right away. So let's take a minute. Just take 1 minute to back to the person at your elbow. Who will be most affected by your teaching? And can you think of at least one unavoidable dilemma that you might have? So I asked you, it sounds like you could at least identify one unavoidable dilemma you expect you'll face in your career. And the truth of the matter is, people think about technology and teaching and assume they just go together naturally. They do. But not without conflict, and we'll talk about many of the kinds of conflicts that can occur. But one of the conflicts just starts with the fact that we tend to talk about technology as though we all understood it, or we're using the same language, or referring to the same things. And so one of the things I've learned in my conversations with people about technology in the classroom is always to ask them what they mean by the various terms they're using. Like, let's just take one for example. Let me just start with a little quiz. What is 21st century skills? What are 21st century skills? I have heard 21st century skills all the place, but would you please just turn to the person, you have 10 seconds to tell them what 21st century skills are. What's on your list? And yet, as a matter of fact, when you start thinking about this, people mean all kinds of different things by 21st century skills. Looking just up at the screen, you'll see 15 common models and use that you'll find in conversation with any group of educators in California today. And all of those are different takes on what 21st century skills mean. Endless lists of C's. For some reason, C's are very popular, and so you'll see that there's lists of the 4 C's, and the 7 C's, and the 8 C's. So what are your C's? If I were to ask you what you think are the most important skills for students in the 21st century, and they all have to start with C, you have 90 seconds to come up with your list of C's. Turn to the person behind you, meet someone else, introduce them, and come up with your list of C's. 90 seconds, go. we could compile the list if you're really interested to see the different things people would come up with. I teach at a university. Its mission is actually what we call the 3 C's: competence, compassion, and conscience, which we consider the 3 organizing values for the university. And we use them so much that every student around a place immediately parrots them. If I start any question as to with what's important, I know somebody will either seriously or sarcastically invoke the 3 C's almost immediately. But they're part of the fabric of what we do. We still think they're 21st century skills. Actually, I thought they were 1st century skills, and I think they'll be 30th century skills. But the question is, what are the skills that are most important? As a starting point, if I, as a professional, ethical person, wish to go about teaching, I ought to be clear about what we're trying to do, where we are trying to go, in a bigger picture than just whatever particular set of standards have been adopted these days. Not that I don't think those are a good idea, but there's got to be a bigger vision that captures us here. So what are those 21st century skills? Some colleagues of mine at Michigan State recently did a series of studies where they pulled a content analysis of all the different proposals to see what they have in common. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but they found basically at the end of the day, everybody's list had some kind of statement about what they thought people should know, how they thought people should act, and what kind of values people should have. And that you don't really find, we find the lists are quite different from each other, but they each give us a picture, in philosophy we call it the good life, a picture of what a person would be in this good life that tells us about the way, what kinds of things people would know, what's worth knowing. What ways ought we to act, and what would be most important for us to value? And so the C's give us a way of doing that. The heart of being a professional, ethical teacher, being clear about who you are and what the enterprise we're involved in, so that it's clear, so that it's public, so that it's fair. There's nothing worse than a hidden curriculum, a hidden agenda, a hidden set of values, an unmet set of assumptions that drive our education instead of one that's public. And really the purpose of the C's is to say something about where are we going with this education and how does that work. That brings us to a couple of questions here. We could go into endless details about that, but I'm going to stop for a moment. I'm going to talk a lot tonight about blended learning models, because that happens to be something I work in particularly. Much of my work is training teachers to use blended learning in their classrooms, and so we have a lot of demonstration projects. It interests me, but I wonder about it. I'm very involved in the doing of it, but then sometimes I wonder if it's such a great idea. I wonder what's lost when we do that as well as what's gained, even as I'm busy producing curriculum and training teachers who do that. We have one project that involves 109 teachers in 7 Catholic schools that are reshaping their particular schools to move into a blended learning model. We have another project that's in juvenile halls in a number of counties and states doing a blended learning model. So they can be very different populations, but raises some of the same questions. More on that in just a moment as I kind of move in, but I'd like to go back to some more fundamental questions about ethics first, though. So I'm going to throw another word out. Now I'm going to keep going back and forth where you have to go to a partner and do things, but that's how I make sure you don't fall asleep in the middle of the lecture. Character. If someone says, or talks about your character, what do you think they're immediately going to tell you? And where do you think you got yours? Where do you think you got your character? Teachers. You know, so we could spend the rest of the month just on this question alone. What is character? Does it exist? And how does it get formed? And I'm going to try in about 5 or 6 minutes to answer that question. And then you'll all leave here wondering why I bothered, but that's another story. Here's the question. Character, you know, some people talk about character that is the single variable that determines what you do and that you have or don't. I don't believe in that kind of character. I think it's a very complicated variable. I think it comes from lots of places. I think it's always changing. I think the good news about character is no matter what you think of your character right now, you can change it. It can move in a different direction. The bad news is no matter how great your character is today, it can go right downhill tomorrow. It's always a work in progress. But it's a central question if you're a teacher, because the work of teaching is the work of character formation, both the formation of my own character and those who I mentor as a teacher in this process. That is, I want to talk about professional ethics apart from codes of conduct for professional associations, which I think are important to give us a start, but aren't sufficient. Or the rules, or people will come and say, well, you just need to apply the smell test. If it smells bad, don't do it. Well, I suppose that may be helpful at some level. I'd like something that helps us to understand a little bit better what we're doing as teachers and what's happening to us ourselves. Deborah Brody, one of my colleagues who's in legal ethics, always says that she doesn't buy characters, she thinks it's just a figment of our aspirations. That it's just a way that, but I like to suggest that character, a complicated variable, might be a way of describing who I am today in terms of the habits I have, the behaviors I engage in. And if we're thinking about what we do as teachers, the kind of people we're becoming ourselves and the kind of people that we're forming. Now, one of the questions I answer all the time, we have a program that's used in 42 counties and 7 other states in juvenile halls. And so one of the questions teachers often ask is, how do I form the character, who am I to form the character of anyone in a juvenile hall? And we try to reframe it in terms of not about I'm forming your character because of the splendid attainment of character I have myself, but as a journey that we're both on. And my journey and character and yours intersect at a certain point. Now before I've talked about kind of how character forms, but I'd like to raise the question of, is it different in a digital world? Does the level and pace of digital information change character formation? And I'll ask you to come back to that question in just a second. A way we could think of it simply is, if we were to look at studies of moral formation and development, we can kind of come to the idea that there are at least 10 things that affect the formation of character, and there are many others. But I like to focus on these 10 because they're things that a teacher or a parent can do something about. They have to do with the way we come to have our values, the thought processes we engage in, and the skills we use to deal with the dilemmas that are inevitable in our lives. Now those values, those firmly held dispositions come from role models like parents, other adults, peers, and mass media. And so I know as a teacher, many of the people who are important in forming values were teachers that I had, and that I had a role. What I do, values are more surely caught than they are taught. What I do can carry on to other people. But does it change in a digital world? When your role models are more virtual, when more of the input to your values comes not just from the groups you participate in and the individuals you know, but the experiences you have online, does it change the values that you pick up from those role models? Have you ever noticed that people online can be a whole lot less kind than if they were with you in person? Have you ever noticed that the limits on the kind of information people share on service is very different, that there's a different set of moral norms that appears to operate online? And yet, precisely one of our jobs as a teacher is to help model and help kids understand those kind of presences we have, virtual and real. Legends and heroes are another important source. Who are the heroes in your life? But we've always thought of character formation as kind of coming from the heroes you actually can interact with. For most kids today, those are more likely virtual heroes, people you meet in an electronic world, people that have an electronic life. And so the way we think about what it means to be heroic, what it means to be a person, doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in flesh or embodied at all. You can be entirely virtual. Does that change things? What about reinforcement? We know values are built by what works out for you in life, what you get, what you seek to avoid. But what about in a world of instancy? One of the things the media does, that technology does, it speeds everything up. And you get everything so immediately. Paul Kupferman wrote a critique of schools 25 years ago where he talked about the problem of having moved from the teacher as Miss Grundy to the teacher as Johnny Carson, the expectation that entertainment is a primary role of teachers, not just dispensing information. But we're long past that point. We're now at the point where we're not competing with Johnny Carson, we're competing with ghosts, we're competing with video games, we're competing with a world that is far more instant, far more immediate, can give more precise, more filtered, more specific feedback than I can ever do as a person. I'm competing as a teacher with machines that can outdo me on all kinds of skills and can't do at all some other kinds of skills. So how does reinforcement change? How does the whole fabric of what pays off change in that process? Finally, perhaps one of the greatest sources of our values are the narratives, the family stories we hear, the stories we hear from our peers, the literature that's read shows, the things. Think about all the things you learn from that narrative. But how does that narrative change when it is social and constructed electronically? When much of the story you know is from people you don't actually know in the physical sense, or stories you don't get in that way, and also because of social media, it's not a story you receive, it's a story you're creating. What happens when the narratives that affect our life are always in process, and you don't know what you're going to find out at the next instant? When we start talking about technology ethics, one of the questions I'm concerned about is knowledge in the world is different with the technologies we have. It changes the whole way we relate to these things, but our teaching hasn't really caught up with that yet. Do we teach students skills for that in what we do? Thought processes that are important for character formation include the ability to problem solve and being able to use a process and really struggle with ambiguities and move through. But in a world where you're always looking for the help box or the instant solution to your problem or the online help, do we have the ability to solve problems that way anymore? Do we ever have the time to reflect on our experiences? You know, much of character is formed from wisdom that we get from what we've learned from our own life experience, but if you never have time because you're always on to what's next and next and next, and you're being electronically prompted on top of it, that doesn't happen, or at least doesn't happen in the same way. Finally, the ethical life, can consist of at least two kinds of problems. One being what I like to call the easy problems, not because they're easy to live with, but because they're easy to solve. Those are the cases where I know what I ought to do. I know what the right thing is. I'm facing a situation, I know what I ought to do. I just don't want to do it, right? And that's probably most of our moral life, right? It's not really that unclear. The alarm goes off in the morning. Should you smash it or answer it? You see someone you'd rather not deal with at Thanksgiving, do you talk to them or do you suddenly bolt out the door? Our life is full of these things where I know what the right thing is. It's just, it's hard to do it. I don't want to do it. It would cost too much to do it. There's some reason I don't want to. But what if it's not that simple? The hard cases are the ones where it is not at all clear to me what I ought to do. It is much more complicated than that. How do I actually figure out what to do? That's what requires a framework, a way of thinking through it systematically. Professional ethics requires looking at those situations, those dilemmas, those cases where it's not clear and having a method. The handouts you have are a method that we proposed at the Markle Center. I'm going to come back to it in a moment and talk about the 10 kinds of questions and approaches we think we should use for that, which is as important, more important perhaps with technology choices than anything else. I'm going to ask you to apply it to a case in a moment. But do you have the time to decide, or do you find yourself in the middle of the ethical decision you made before you ever had a chance to think of whether it's where you want to be? Character depends on thinking straight rather than crazily. But I talked about the problem with online versus in-person ways that people deal with each other. And one of the realities for kids in the digital world is that crazy behavior is multiplied by the speed of the devices that we use. And so there's far more to deal with than ever was true before. What are the skills that our moral life depends on? Ever done something that if you had the ability to better impulse control, better anger management, better emotional management, you wouldn't have said, wouldn't have done? We realize that our moral life very much depends on some of these qualities like coping skills. But how do you cope with a cyber attack and the things that happen like that? Or cooperation skills and ability to get along with others. And again, in a world that requires endlessly working with teams with different roles, how does that change? The question I'll get out there for a second is, how does the world change when we look at technology that way? So let's just take an example of a case for 1 second here. You're teaching in a school. You're working really hard. You're feeling impoverished, but that comes with being a teacher. There's been a lot of noise about the school. You've seen Twitter feeds that criticize the way things are done at the school. A few of you have mentioned Judy. There's anonymous posts about what goes on. You see some things about your classroom. You go to various rating places to see what people think, and you find out that you're not rating very well these days. You've even seen some unflattering pictures of yourself on Instagram. And the Yelp review of the school made it sound like you people were practically criminal as this goes on. You've heard there's some things on some Facebook posts from people in your classroom that really disturb you in a lot of ways. And you're beginning to feel like a target. You see a YouTube video one day and you discover it's late at night, you're bored, and you start searching with "My Teacher Hates Me." And you discover there's thousands of videos made by kids reporting why they hate their teachers. And all of a sudden you run into one of them here.
YouTubers, this is Wrestling Guy Bitch, better known as Kevin Edwards. Today I want to talk about my 11th grade science teacher, and I really don't care if she sees this. Actually, I hope she does, just so she knows how much I hate her.
Now, you're working really hard, you're really in the midst of all of this. What would you like to say? You're asked, you see this and all of a sudden, what would you like to do? How would you like to respond to that? Back to the person at your elbow. What would you do? An inevitable dilemma of being a teacher. In an age of high-speed social media, you'll find out things about yourself you don't want to hear. What are you going to do when you find that out? How do you respond to that? How do you restore the relationships with people in your classroom and make that work when it happens? Professional ethics is easy as long as no one's targeting you. What happens when it turns in your direction? What skills let you continue to be professional at that point? And so when I start talking about technology, I understand that it's a great tool for learning. It's also a tool for a lot of things that happen in school. And so we have to think about our responses and what we do. So let's think for a second. What other dilemmas might you face in school that you might have to do something with? I just gave you a personal one, fairly common. The number of these incidents where things are posted in schools trending goes gone up astronomically. So we talk about cyberbullying in the classroom, but that's more interesting to think about it if you're the teacher, if you're the target, instead of thinking about a student as the target. How do you respond? Inevitable dilemmas when there's more information, that information can be used more ways. What are some of the other dilemmas we often face with the use of technology in the school? What is blended learning? When you hear that term, what do you think about for a second? So let me start again, raise the question, what's blended learning and where have you seen it? When you think of blended learning, what's an example of a blended learning program that you think of? The educational mix of face-to-face instruction with computer-mediated or aided instruction in some combination. So when we talk about that, we have lots of terms we use for that, whether you call it hybrid. Actually, I teach a class where I look at the 100 different ways people describe this thing, and they actually mean something different depending on what they mean. When I use the term blended learning, what I mean is the degree to which you blend face-to-face instruction in a brick-and-mortar institution with some form of online instruction, where you're not just using technology-enhanced instruction, but you're actually delivering education online some part of the time. That can go all the way from occasional, most of the time you're face-to-face with occasional use of online things, all the way to the program's almost entirely online. But hot topic in schools is, what do you do with blended learning? What kind of model do you have? We work with schools with all kinds of different models. But maybe the first thing would be, okay, we know what blended learning is, sort of. We know that there's a lot of different models for it. We know that all of them have in common that it results in more student control of time, place, path, and pace. So the other part of the definition that's important is the blended learning blends those things, but in a way that ends up with more student control over those things in their education. Okay? Now, there are lots of models, and the Clayton Christensen Institute has identified one of the most common models we talk about as a way of looking at it from rotation bias, and I'm not going to bother with the details of that tonight. But I just want to give an example. One of the most commonly known is the lab rotation model, and it became well known because of a program in San Jose called Rocket Ship Cisequete School, which was one of the first to really implement it as a school base. We're just going to take a look at it for a second.
Right now we have 7 schools. We opened our first school in 2007. I'm the principal of the second school, which we opened 2 years later. We are aspiring to serve 1 million kids to close the academic achievement gap in our lifetimes. Next year we will open our first school outside of California in Milwaukee. Fundamentally, we believe in doing this through 4 key pillars. The first is student achievement and individualizing our education. The second is elevating the teaching profession so that we can recruit and retain top talent. The third is partnering with families. And the last is simply to grow. So this is Rocket Ship Cisequete Academy. We are known as the outdoor school. We have a beautiful California campus. We have 660 kids. We're in our 4th year. We are the largest of the rocket ships right now. We have 35 instructional staff and a variety of...
So, in this model that you just looked at, we saw, what are the values that are important in the school? Actually, the question I want to raise for you, this is a school that's inspired lots of people and has scared lots of people. one of the things that's resulted is it caused a lot of other private schools as well as public schools to really question what they're doing in the same community, as they saw this different model being employed in the school. And the question is, just about everyone in the area of that school has now moved to a blended learning model. But why should you move to a blended learning model? Should we do it because other people are doing it and getting the kids we might otherwise get? Are we doing it because we believe it's a more successful model? Are we doing it because we believe we'll be criticized if we don't? Are we doing it because we think it's cool and it's the latest use of technology? What would be a good reason, let's just say for the sake of argument that this is an effective model, and the data would suggest it is, at least at the school site. What would be a good reason to move to a blended learning model? Take a second just to ask yourself that question. What would be a good reason? Just kind of, what would you consider an acceptable reason to do that? Would it result in more success in a school? Now, what's involved technically when a school actually does that? You know, another way that you could do blended learning would be schools that use a different kind of rotation model called a station rotation model. And KIPP, the Knowledge Park program, I'm deliberately using two charter schools as examples because I usually work with public or Catholic schools. But let's just take a look at their model for a second.
Right now, just 4% of students entering high school in South Los Angeles are graduating from college. For us, that's unacceptable. If I could think of one word to describe what a school should do for its students, is to empower them for the future. So I chose the name Empower for our school name. For our students to be fully empowered means to be strong in mind, body, and spirit.
Now, as you think about that, by the way, there's 9 films with models of different schools doing this. They're all available online. Let me go look at the slides tomorrow, so if you want to watch the full capture on these places, you can do that later. But otherwise, we'd be here for 3 hours just looking at the film first. I actually just want to raise a question, a different way of doing it. It starts a project that really started as a character education project in New York, focused on the kind of virtues that allow students to succeed in the midst of classroom reduction. California finds that better use of technology is going to be critical if they're going to continue to make the gains they've been making, and that's the reason they originally flipped to it. It got my interest because that particular school happens to be a feeder for the high school I was principal of 30 years ago. And I know what it was like back then, and I know what it's like now. And it's a very different story in Los Angeles when I look at the effectiveness of some of the programs. It's actually what made me very interested in how we could actually use that in some other street programs. But what are the reasons for moving to the program? What would make that acceptable? So as I talk about what does it mean to be a teacher in a digital world, what it means is I have to know content, I have to know how to teach, and I have to know technology. I have to be able to use technology in a way that actually moves education forward. So what are the problems that can occur with that? So that's the question twice, and I'm going to ask you again. I would like you to come up with what are 2 good reasons for a school to go to blended learning? What would be 2 terrible reasons for a school to go to blended learning? Share with your partner. You have 1 minute. I want to talk for a couple of minutes. I'm going to use blended learning as my primary example tonight. I'm going to do that because it's where most of the discussion is focused these days with a lot of schools. A lot of schools are looking at how to change things. I'm going to look at blended learning because it's inevitable if you're a teacher that the intersection of the digital and the teaching world will be in how you blend the 2 together. What does it actually look like in your classroom? People use a lot of words to talk about this. Here's some of them up on the board. And again, people use them synonymously, so we have to kind of get clear on what we mean by those different words. But actually I want to take it in a little different direction. What does blended learning blend? And one of the ways you have to think about it is what happens when a school program wants to go to blended learning and what kind of conflicts come up as you do that. And much of my life the last couple of years has been working with schools through the university that are moving to blended learning models. We're going to start by talking about what are we going to blend? How are we going to do this? What does this involve? What will make this a value added to education? And what inevitable ethical dilemmas will we face in the process of doing that? I'm going to kind of take you through the process for a minute, and I'm going to put you in the middle of a dilemma that I'm going to ask you to solve. We'll have to come back to the framework in order to do that, so if you have that handy, you'll be using it in a minute. So often I walk into a school situation, and what I'm told is someone, school board, someone in charge has decided the school's a problem, we need to do something, we need to move about this, and we want to see an increase in test scores by the end of this year. Right? So a not uncommon solution because we'll make better use of technology and a miracle will happen. And so I usually catch my breath at this point and try to talk about, let's talk about what we can really do and how this would really work. Okay? So let's talk about how does a school go from where it is to being a blended learning school. You don't go by going from where you are to blended learning in 1 week, though everyone tries to do that, right? What actually happens is we start by, it all begins with traditional instruction. Actually, teacher-directed classroom instruction to achieve outcomes is really important as a starting point. And getting to where people are consistently good at planning, delivering, monitoring, assessing, and adapting classroom instruction. The basic skills of teaching. I'm starting there because one of the things we find out is if you add computers that go even faster, all the things that aren't working in your school just happen more often and more quickly. One of the inevitable dilemmas of teaching in a digital world is in a faster, quicker world, mistakes get multiplied. For our triumphs, hopefully. But the problem is your sloppiness with data, a lack of planning, other things can actually create far greater problems than was ever true before. Are you ready for a world that's moving even faster than the one you're in? Actually, we start by working with teachers on some of the basics of how you connect with students, how you work in a classroom, what do we do, how can we be the best kind of face-to-face school, and then decide how we want to add technology into that mix. Then we move to technology-enhanced instruction. Having thought about what we can really do in our face-to-face encounters, how would technology enhance that? Which technologies would allow us to do a better job than what we're doing now? Now, there's a model we use for this called the SAMR that I'll reference in a minute, but it's the idea, how do we get away from just substituting a technology for something we're doing well already? We have iPads and they become very expensive notebooks. To actually move to a level where we transform the educational process and are able to do new things and learn in new ways that we couldn't before. And there are various stages at which we can actually learn to do that. But our primary focus at this level is how do we use the technologies well? Because one of the inevitable dilemmas is that toys are attractive, but they may be more expensive, less timely ways to do what we can already do well. How do we ensure in a digital world that the tools we're choosing actually are getting us an added value in our actual education? And how do I make sure that the toys aren't just the ones I like? It's the tools versus toys argument in education. What are we really using and how are we using it in the classroom? From technology-enhanced instruction, where we're using the best available technologies in an effective, efficient, and socially valid way, how it makes sense for the people we're using it with, then inevitably schools get to a device implementation. We spend a lot of time studying what happens if schools will bring their own device approaches as to ones to standardize on a device and find for effectiveness. There are lots of device solutions, but having one is a great idea. But how do you make the decision when it involves investments of huge amounts of money, lots of personal preferences? One of the inevitable dilemmas in the process is that you have to make choices of technology in which people have vested interest, often vested interest in that school. Now, thankfully, I get to experience this at Ground Zero because two of the schools in our project are actually on opposite sides of Google's headquarters. And, we're an Apple project. So Apple is one of the major participants in the project. So we use a lot of different kinds of technologies with different projects. But I think for a second, one of the things I can be certain of when I go to a parent meeting is almost every technological solution will be represented by someone in the room more expert than me and with more invested personally and potentially more conflict of interest as a result of it. Then how do I work through that? Well, we have to come up with an orderly way of doing a device implementation, and the problem is that those of you who do this in schools know it means it has to be an integrated adoption. You have to study the infrastructure in the school, look at what devices work with them, what platforms are going to run on them, what applications you need, what programs will operate within them, what interventions you use when those aren't working, what analytics you need to make decisions about instruction, what kind of professional development you'll need to make this work for teachers, and then right back to the infrastructure. And no part of this can be solved without doing all the parts together, or you have a disaster, right? Because we decided on the device and we didn't find out what we wanted to do with it, and now we can't do the things we want. The greatest inevitable dilemma we face is how to make those decisions when the level of personal preference and the level of personal experience and financial interest among those making decisions can be extraordinarily high, being influenced by all kinds of people. It gives us a chance to look at that. I'll come back to the stage in a minute. But to get to blended learning, after we kind of get to, we know what the system, we've got a way of using technologies together, and we have to learn how to use adaptive learning. That is, computer instruction, the advantage of computer instruction is if it's adaptive, if it actually adapts to where the learner is. And I don't mean a simple behavioral model. I don't mean it just figures out which things you don't know using analytics that may or may not be reliable. But I mean is actually able to shape which learning experiences you experience online based on your previous choices. And so it allows you to make much more efficient use of your time. So how many are familiar with ST Math? Does that ring a bell here? ST Math is spatial temporal math. It was developed by UC Irvine. We're using it in projects both in juvenile halls and in regular elementary schools all over the place. And there's no words. It's entirely visual math. It's all games. Now, I'm not really good at games, so the first time I played it, I realized this is not for me. But I watch every kid in the classroom who does this, and they pick it up immediately, and it does great things, because you learn every concept in math by helping this penguin cross the road. The whole thing is endless video games helping this little penguin cross the road, and every math concept you could ever imagine is involved in that. We have kids spending 90 minutes a week in this program. You can spend 90 minutes a week in it forever. I've been trying 90 minutes a week just so I can try to understand it myself. But what we see is that it adapts constantly to what problem-solving methods the student is using, what steps the student doesn't get, other ways of doing it. And we see that students who are not making progress in math are now making progress in math. So I'll give you an example. In our juvenile hall program, we have students who tried to move into an algebra program unsuccessfully for years. We found that by rebuilding their fundamental concepts of math using these games, we're able to significantly increase the number of students who are able to enter and succeed in an Algebra 1 program. Similarly, in a third grade program in a Catholic school, we're able to significantly number the students who could meet the benchmarks by the end of third grade in a downtown school where that had not been happening. So we've had a couple of great experiences with it, but adaptive learning that's a whole nother way of teaching, learning about teaching. It's doing all the things I do as a teacher in person if I have the time to do it, but I don't. So it also means adaptive assessments. Here's some that we particularly use in this program, and now we have these adaptive measures that we use for assessment and these various kinds of learning that we use together. And that eventually allows us to put blended learning together, and when we kind of take all those pieces and put them together. Now, I wanted to point out that there's a whole process that really we go through, and yet one of the inevitable dilemmas is that everyone wants the results yesterday. And so everyone wants to skip to the fifth step instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and yet we know programs are not successful unless they build in that direction. So one of the inevitable dilemmas in the use of technologies is that you may not be very good at them, you may not know very much about them, and it may take you a whole lot more time to get the level of skill you need to be effective with them than you have right at the moment. I mentioned that we use in ethics a variety of approaches for thinking about how we solve a dilemma in the classroom. Right? And so I'd like you to just take a moment and think about what a dilemma might look like and how you might actually go through that. And one of in the framework that I gave you in the Markle Center, you have this kind of ethical decision-making model that says there's really 10 things you want to look at. So you want to recognize whether you have an ethical issue, see if it's more than just a question of what's legal. You want to make sure you've got the facts straight, figure out who's impacted by the decision and what your options are. Then you want to evaluate them by 5 questions. 5 questions that use some of the classic moral traditions that you will learn in an ethics class. And so we kind of distill them down to some questions. The background material you have available tonight gives you ways of thinking about that. Which option produces the most good and the least harm? Which option best respects the rights of all affected? Which option best treats people equally or fairly? Which option best serves the community as a whole, as the common good? And which option leads me to act like the kind of person I'd like to be? Then I consider those options and what's best, test it out, check with some people, and see what happens. Now, you have that on the sheet in front of you, but actually what I'd like to do is stop with a partner for a second and use kind of a systematic way of thinking about it. Here's the problem. You're in the school, and through an act of Congress, you've been made principal. You're now in charge. Some of you look like maybe you are that person, but you're in charge and you're told you have to have a blended learning model in place in a year. And it's going to be part of a parent consulting process. You gather parents together and you find out that a great many of the people in your community, both teachers and parents, already have pretty firm opinions about this, and many of whom work in places that cause them to know a lot, but also have a direct conflict of interest in the matter. You have to decide who's going to be on the planning team. I said that planning team has to decide on what teaching practices we're going to use, how we're going to enhance it with technology, what kind of devices we're going to use, how this will all fit together, and then how we use those with adaptive learning to get to blended learning. But you have to decide who's going to be on this, and the question you face right away is the people who know the most about it also have a direct conflict of interest in the acquisition of these tech materials. So who's going to be on the team, and how are you going to decide? Now, we spend a couple hours sometimes taking people through this dilemma and looking at it because it's one of the ones I teach to people who are principals, and this is one they all have to deal with, is when you're a parent advisory board. So how do I deal with that interest? Well, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to figure it out. Would you turn to the person behind you? And if you were the person in charge and you're responsible for constituting a team and setting the ground rules for how they operate, how are you going to solve this inevitable dilemma that the people with the expertise also have direct interest in the area and they conflict? What are you going to do? You have 2 minutes. About understanding what conflicts might emerge in the midst of that, understanding the dilemmas you face, and that some of those are inevitable. That there's at least 20 you can figure on, starting with that free can be very expensive. That student risk is always around, and you can't pay for student access, pay with student access or information that may in fact result in real conflicts between our outcomes and our notions of the good life. That is, whose privacy are you selling? And can anyone really consent under those circumstances? Computers speed and multiply errors at a rate that no one could have thought before, and helping students understand their digital footprint is always a problem. How do you challenge information once it's there? How do you deal with the convenient truths? The gated e-communities allow everyone to decide what their version of the truth in the world they're going to know. It's only the news you want. Can we have knowledge and freedom? Are we blending or blurring? Foucault said we should revolt in the midst of all of this. Well, perhaps. I'd like to suggest, I mentioned the product cblnewsworthy.com. Every day we pick out 20 news stories that we think have some significant ethics issues in them that would be worthwhile for middle school and high school students. We put out a lesson plan that, written to the Common Core standards, takes you through 11 activities you could do with that news story. We pick one news story in particular, give you a number of other ones, and the lesson plan is there for you to use. This material the students can use as part of a blended learning program online by themselves, or that you can use with the students in the classroom, or that they can be doing at home. It comes out every Monday through Friday, every week. It's free to any teacher who wishes to use it. Teachers either use it to teach informational text in their English classes, or for high school and middle school advisory periods where they bring people together. The real question is, what do you do with this? I'd like to end by suggesting, at the end of the day, we have to do something. And the question is, how do we bring this together in a way that works best? I've touched on many topics about professional ethics and teaching in the digital world. In simplest terms, it's not enough to just be a teacher or know your content. The ethics of choosing and using the right tools has changed the game entirely. I thank you for your time and attention tonight. I'll be up here afterwards. We're available online at the Markle Center. We have a variety of other products you might find helpful that are available to you as well.